Do you know what the best part of Resident Evil 6 was? The credits! Oh, no! Let's get serious here. At some point, in some way, someone thought about this game as the future of the series. And no, I'm not talking about the gameplay, I'm talking about the characters. Resident Evil 6 was stuffed to the gills with characters across its 4 campaign scenarios. Yes, it's too much. What's most important is that whilst the game was built around that one shot of Chris and Leon giving broody faces and doing manly shouting at each other, it wasn't just a coming together of classic protagonists. Out of Resident Evil 6's 7 playable characters, 3 of them were brand new. That's nearly half of them, and honestly, if we talk truthfully, the Sherry Birkin we play as is so far away from the 90 seconds we play as in Resident Evil 2, that you can arguably say that 4 of the 7 are new characters, and that's over half. In a way, Resident Evil 6 was hoping to make players comfortable enough for when the time came to pass the torch to a new set of heroes. And then 7 and Village came along and ruined everything. I'm kidding, of course, they're brilliant games with a really great narrative that were the right and necessary thing to do after RE6's gameplay drove the series into a well of generic action madness that it was going to struggle to come back from if it kept pursuing. So I'm by no means bitter about these games at all, but it's hard for me not to be concerned about what the last slew of Resident Evil titles, especially the remakes, as good as they are, have done for the state of the canon and the Biohazard world. And I'm not talking about questions like, did Jill kill Nemesis at the Dead Factory, or Nest 2, but those are valid. More like, what happens next? I'm Cy for First Aid Spray, and this is Resident Evil, The Next Generation. This video will contain spoilers from Resident Evil Village now. At the end of Resident Evil Village, when all hope seems lost and Ethan Winters has literally had his heart ripped out, it's down to the Hound Wolf squad to infiltrate the village and cut a path through the Mega Mycete led by former STARS Alpha Point Man and one of the founding 11 members of the BSAA, Chris Bloomin' Redfield. Chris Bloomin' Redfield is 48 years old. Resident Evil 6 takes place in 2012 and Village takes place in 2021, so at this stage it's been nearly a decade since the release, can you believe it, and the events of that game, which means it's been nearly 10 years since we've heard from its cast of new characters. To make matters worse, it's been nearly as long, just as long, or even longer since we've heard from the other series mainstays like Leon, last appearance CGI film Vendetta, which seems to be set in 2014, Claire, last appearance in Revelations 2, set in 2011, and you all know this one by now, Jill Valentine, last appearance Resident Evil 5, set in 2009. So what I'm saying is, if a game releases that's set in 2022, all of those characters would be 10 years older, all the brighter younger cast go from their early 20s to their early 30s, and the mainstay force start bumping up into their late 40s. By the time of Resident Evil 9, let's assume, is released and set in 2024, Chris and Jill will be in their early 50s. Something needs to happen, and it needs to happen yesterday. Yes, it's this controversial take again, and funnily enough, it's been going around at the moment. I promise this wasn't planned, but these main 4 characters are reaching the end of their time in starring roles from a logical perspective. I mean, sure, let's face it, Capcom are just going to pretend time isn't a factor, and we'll be playing as a spry 60-year-old Chris Redfield in 10 years' time, who is no less physically imposing than he was when he was punching boulders back as a young man in his mid-30s. Companies believe in the importance of recognisable characters, which I totally understand, but also Resident Evil 7, a brand new reset for the series with a blank slate protagonist, didn't exactly do too badly, and said blank slate sequel is on track to do pretty good. So as I say, it made sense for them to make these games, and it makes sense for Resident Evil 9 to continue that story even further. But the Winters family's story seems to be perhaps concluding, and moreover, it can't be the only story strand we have in the continuing narrative. We need new stories, new faces, and a new era of Resident Evil. And this is where I come now, brandishing this script like a weapon. This is all my opinion, obviously, and this is all my own wants and headcanon, so, you know, don't get mad, but this is what I think needs, not just what I think should happen, but what I think needs to happen in Resident Evil ASAP. Let's start with the most obvious. Sherry Birkin. Sherry Birkin should be the lead character of the series moving forward. Should it be an ensemble cast? Yes, of course, but Sherry should lead this next generation of characters for one main reason. She can be the one figure who holds or returns the interest of casual or lapsed fans. She has the most connections to the classic lore, as a daughter to Dr. Birkin, a carrier of the G-Virus, and a survivor of the Raccoon City incident, which Capcom insists gets a mention every 60 minutes or so in Resident Evil. She also has connections to previous characters, as we see on screen with Leon and with Chris in Resident Evil 6, and her longtime friendship with Claire, allowing references and even cameos from them through their relationship with Sherry. What's most important is the answer to the key issue I was just talking about. Because of her time being infected with the G-Virus, Sherry ages slower than most people. She can stick around in the series a lot longer than most because of it, and her regenerative powers, you could argue, would also mean that the usual wear and tear of age would also have a reduced effect on her. And I almost hate to say this, but her continued youthful appearance would just appeal to Capcom, let's face it. It makes marketing a female lead for an extended period of time a lot easier. There's a reason we haven't seen Claire and Jill in the canon for 10 to 12 years, even though Chris and Leon keep showing up looking more chiseled, more haggard, and more quote-unquote distinguished. With that gross dose of reality out of the way, let's return to the fun, and there's so many reasons why Sherry is a great lead. Some of her other key personality traits are her dutifulness, her sense of justice, and her care for others, something that's true of all four of RE's classic characters, especially the Redfields. Like Claire, she's kind-hearted and seeks the best out of people wherever possible. This isn't necessarily untrue of the next character, but if Sherry is a soft cinnamon bun, then Moira Burton is the spiciest firecracker to have walked the earth. Moira's foul-mouthed, take-no-BS attitude and penchant for smacking things with crowbars makes her a totally different prospect, but with some really strong similarities to Sherry all the same. They were both mentored in a way by Claire Redfield, and even beyond that they have the literal next-generation advantage, as Moira can also reference her father. And let's face it, a now 61-year-old Barry Burton is going to be worrying about his daughter every time she goes out with TerraSave or whoever she winds up aligned with, and that'll make for some really fun commentary. We've never had a game with two female lead characters before, and the idea of Revelations 3 with soft Sherry and spicy Moira just sounds like the best damn time. Okay, a lot of these characters are kind of Sherry based, so deal with it, but this one is extremely obvious. Jake Wesker may have been a bit edgy in 2012, but his writing was good and his arc was solid. By his early 20s he'd already been through various war zones, so it'd be interesting to see where he's found himself in 2021. Other than name-dropping Raccoon City, Capcom's other struggle has been finding a way to keep Albert Wesker a part of the narrative in some form, and whilst I'm not personally interested in elements of that, Jake could definitely be the character to do this. That we know of, he has no particular allegiance, so if he was interested in investigating the Wesker program, or tracking down the mysterious Dr. Wesker, or even finding himself in secret forgotten laboratories where Albert worked on Ouroboros, it would be a way to add Wesker's mystique after the fact, because he's dead and he should stay that way. As for a second male character, again it's obvious, but it was viciously taken away from us. It's been talked about to death, even by us, but the end of Chris's campaign in Resident Evil 6 was completely completely the wrong move. Imagine a world where Chris is immortalised by sacrificing himself for the future of anti-BOW warfare, and Piers Nivens completes his destiny by rising up the BSAA to make his mentor proud. If you didn't like Piers in RE6, imagine a world where the helmet comes off at the end of 7 and it's Piers who saves Ethan. Piers who begrudgingly assists Blue Umbrella and takes down Lucas Baker. Piers who relocates Ethan and Mia and then has to charge into the village with the Hound Wolf squad. By this point, he would have been solidified as the next Chris Redfield. Alas, that's not what we have, and the series hasn't really given us many new male characters in the last 10 years, save for Keith and Quint, which, you know, I'm sure they have their fans, but I can't see them leading the franchise. So this is a rare example, I think, of a new character being needed, which is often the best way to go. Make a protagonist who's a window to the world and its characters, who meets the likes of Jake, Sherry and Moira for the first time. And if you're going to make yet another new Resident Evil character, this also means you can not just fix the series' lack of new blood, but also a lack of diversity. We could have a black character who isn't just a police officer who appears for 30 to 60 seconds. The series has had one black protagonist in the numbered entries, and that's Sheva Alomar, and arguably Josh Stone if you count RE5's DLC. And that's where I'd pull from. I'd love for them to have a kid together, but unless you want a 12-year-old as a star, that's probably not going to happen. Josh doesn't have much information on his family background, so there's no reason he doesn't have a kid brother. Or, better yet, Sheva Alomar was taken in by her uncle and 7 cousins. Boom, there you go. And this young lad continues in the footsteps of Sheva and or Josh, joins the West African branch of the BSAA, and then is called out to America later. What's great about these characters is that at the time of writing they all have their own affiliations, or in the case of Jake, lack thereof, and these actually double up with some potential choices for villains. As stated in the recent Infinite Darkness, the US government in the world of Resident Evil, who Sherry last worked with, has a lot to answer for with its history with illegal activity, collaborating with Umbrella back in the 90s, as well as people like Derek Simmons, Senator Ron Davies and Secretary of Defense Wilson, and I'm sure more, using their positions for their own gain. Similarly, we've had implications at the end of Resident Evil Village that the BSAA are being positioned as the next big bad, a tough pill to swallow for our original character Do Not Steal to take after he's looked up to the organisation for all of his life. And finally, there's a character I'm sure is on many minds right now because it's fresh and because it's such an enticing possibility. What of Rose? Like our previous mentions, again, she's the daughter of a key Resident Evil figure, but she's very much separate from everyone else since Ethan only ever interacted with Chris as far as we know. Moreover, Rose has been through a serious tragedy and seems to be hiding away from the world. Her life has been rough without a father and what almost seems like a voice in her head. With her exposure to the mould, it at least seems implied that she can see her late father, and she might have inherited another important trait from Ethan's infection via Evelyn. The post-credit scene in Village doesn't outright tell us it's a time jump, but it also doesn't rule out the possibility that this is only 10, 5, maybe even just 2 years into the future. Evelyn's instability with the mould meant she aged incredibly fast, and it's certainly possible that Rose has suffered the same fate. Imagine the strain on your mental well-being if you could hear the thoughts of your dead father who sacrificed himself for you, only for you to be cursed with rapid aging and very short life expectancy. The twist of Rose being a bad guy is just too great to ignore. Perhaps a bold prediction here, but a fast-aging Rosemary versus a slow-aging Sherry, that feels like it could be big. Okay, we have our who, but I just wanted to reiterate when, and that's immediately. RE9 isn't going to be here for several years, and from RE5 onwards, every numbered entry has been set in the year that it was released, so there's a good chance that that's the case again. Unless RE9 brings together all of the main cast to wrap up some of their stories, then you shouldn't bother at all. Whether our 4 pillars of BOW warfare either retire and walk away into the sunset or heartbreakingly die in the heat of battle, and trust me, if you haven't enjoyed this video you probably would have hated my original darker first draft. Whatever, it's time for a change. Interquels like the Revelations games can be really good, but they obviously take a lot of the threat out of things when you know that that character appears in another entry set 12 months later. Their one major positive is that if the main series of Resident Evil moves forward with the next generation, it doesn't mean that we have to say goodbye to the core cast. Further remakes, if you like, and side stories will allow us to play as the likes of Chris, Leon, Claire and Jill in their prime, especially since for all except Chris particularly have large gaps between appearances that could be expanded upon. These characters who are going to be too old for Resident Evil 10, 11 and 12 can now star in the games that are set in the past, whereas the current day heroes move with the time and we get 10 years at least out of Sherry, Moira, Jake and other guy. But this is all my wants and preferences, and I know to some degree this is ill-timed, and I know for some people this is an infuriating and terrifying direction, because to them, Resident Evil is about a specific set of characters. But for others, this is such a obvious subject, and for the most part a obvious selection of characters. And that's the beauty of the Resident Evil community, the wealth of opinion, as long as we're all kind about each other's ideas anyway. So I invite you to be kind about my ideas, hit up the comments, let me know what you think and what you'd like out of the next 10 years of Resident Evil releases. Who would be in your next generation, or would you scrap it and just play as an 80-year-old Jill Valentine? What did you think of this video? It was kind of a different format from what we usually make. Make sure you hit that like button if you enjoyed it and subscribe to keep up to date with all of our Resident Evil content. I've been Cy for First Aid Spray, and have a good week.